Let's get groovy. Our top story tonight is how the countercultural movement of the 1960s was employed and interpreted differently in the various places it touched around the world. We look back upon the complicated time period that was not just about the peace and love ideals that most people remember it for. Good evening, I'm Ben Tannenbaum, coming to you live from my parents' basement. In just a few moments, we'll interview one of the hottest academic researchers in the world, Ben Tannenbaum. He's going to give us an overview on his paper of the 1960s counterculture movement. In it, he says that the time period radically changed the world both politically and culturally. It's coming out in late May pending further academic review. So thanks for coming, Ben, and let's just start off with a few general points you'd like to go over that everyone should know. Well, thanks for having me tonight, guys. It's always a pleasure, and you're looking pretty good today, Ben. Pretty handsome. You clean up nice. So yeah. Um, so with my paper, I'll just give you guys a rundown. I don't want to spoil it too much for all the viewers at home. So an interesting point that I give in my paper is that these ideals and the genre that promoted them in rock music traveled across the globe, mainly to Europe, North America, and South America. Each continent, country, and sometimes even regions interpreted the wave differently. So, for example, I analyze between in the U.S. between the East Coast and West Coast. There was a congruence in how, even rock music was played, the bands that carried the movements, and, the values they represented. So, for example, on the West Coast, you had the Beach Boys leading the charge. They were kind of like the traditional hippies, peace and love. They had that kind of look going for them. Whereas on the East Coast in New York, you had the Velvet Underground, and they were very artsy, a bit of a depressed, more of a subdued type of look. So these two groups kind of came into congruence, and they were even promoting different drugs, different ideas. So the whole rock movement with hippies in the 60s, especially in America, is not as homogenous as people like to think it is. That's very interesting. Can you give us another point about your research? Another piece of the paper that I find very fascinating actually is where I discuss, it's a bit of a political discipline, but I discuss, all the movements, that we saw really spawn with the time period of the 60s. So we had the infamous civil rights movement, we had feminism, and then I even talk about, I go even into more detail of the, hippie movements that we saw around various places across the globe. So the point I was really making with all these, specifically with these three different movements, is that while the civil rights movement at the top, the leaders really had disagreements on how it should be run and what sorts of ideals they should be following. Like, for example, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King really did not agree on a lot of the fundamentals that made up the civil rights movement. And, they never really, came into contact. But, at the end of the day, they were two very different men. And we see this trend continue with the hippie movement. For example, in Romania, it was interpreted, to have its own, cultural flavor there, and it had to adapt to, the authoritarian government, and it was really walking on eggshells, while still trying to be itself. Whereas in America, the hippies had they were always free to protest and really express their ideas. Where as in different parts of the world, like Romania, it wasn't always the case. Um, Interestingly enough, with feminism, for example, that really got a huge boost with their second wave in the 1960s. They were actually all on the same page in terms of how their fundamentals, affect their message. Whereas with the, civil rights movement and, the hippie movement, we saw a lot of different offshoots of it and different interpretations. So, it's just very interesting to me. Well, it sounds like you have a very rich and compelling paper on your hands. Thanks for coming again. Well, thanks for having me, guys. I hope everyone at home learned something, and I hope this paper could, teach the general public, something they didn't know before. So, thanks for having me, and stay safe. Again, thank you to our very intelligent guest, Ben Tannenbaum. Well, that's gonna be it for all of us here at My Parents' Basement News. Stay classy, and good night.